So thank you so much for the introduction and the floor. First of all, let me start maybe not that traditionally with giving some thanks, since much of the world is celebrating Thanksgiving today. I wanted to mention that I'm really thankful for this project and for this opportunity and for the Central European Academy. It has been invaluable for me in my academic progress. And should we switch or? No. Is it okay? Okay. So I will just continue by saying thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity. I really appreciate this professors network. It has given me so much inspiration, motivation, and so much academic growth. I cannot thank you enough for yes, and friendship. Yes, as Sasha is saying, yes, throughout these years, I think our team has stayed together and has contributed, I hope, a lot to furthering legal science in Central and Eastern Europe and in an international context, and has given us so much. So I'm really thankful today for that. And today I'm going to talk about the best interest principle, and I am going to talk about the best interest principle in the context of the intended child. So it is a topic I think that is a privilege to talk about, but also a responsibility to talk about, because it lies at the intersection of law, ethics, and humanity, and technological innovation. So it is a principle that is a cornerstone of family law, of children's rights. And I remember speaking about the best interest principle in a different context a few years ago, and I remember Professor Szilágyi saying, you mentioned the best interest so many times. And I mention it because it is really a cornerstone of family law, of children's rights, of the protection of the child, because the best interest principle is not only an article in the UNCRC, it is also a principle, a core principle throughout which we examine the other rights of the child, in the context which we see the other rights of the child. So when we talk about this principle, generally, of course, we talk about the existing child. And today we have heard a little bit about the conceived child, the unborn child, but I'm going to go even further and talk about the future possibility of a child, the intended child, so a child that is yet to be conceived. And I think when we apply this principle to children who are yet to be conceived, we see one of the most complex and most provocative questions of our time. As legal scholars, I think we are no strangers to the tension between innovation and tradition, traditional values and technological innovation, and the rights and responsibilities and the balance, the very delicate balance that we have to strike with it. So I think artificial reproductive technologies have an immense power, an immense positive effect in that they are able to create life where there was no chance for a life before. But even though they are able to create life where it was impossible, we also have to acknowledge that there is also peril that it brings forward, this progress, and that's why we have to approach it, I think, very responsibly and sensitively. It challenges us to rethink the fundamental nature of families, of notions of parentage, of notions of identity, and even the very nature of what it means to be a child in the eyes of the law. So because we have, seen these advancements progressing throughout the last, decades, we must pause and ask, are we truly safeguarding the rights and the dignity of the children who will be born through these technologies? Or are we allowing the desires of adults who are hoping and wishing for a family to overshadow the welfare of the most vulnerable? So today I invite you to explore this topic with me and to apply the best interest principle to the intended child, and to examine whether our laws and practices are forward-looking as the technologies, or whether we are still trying to keep pace with the technological advancement. So the question is, how are we able to protect the rights of children who exist only as intentions, and how can we ensure their best interests are the prioritized in the systems that often prioritizes adults' needs first? So these questions are, of course, not just theoretical, they have a very practical effect, and that's why they demand our attention and debate and ultimately our action. So generally when I talk about the purpose of family law to my students at home, I always highlight the child as the focal point. If we didn't have the child, we wouldn't necessarily need family law because, general private law provisions might have sufficed to regulate marriage and other aspects of family law. But the child is the focal point. Why generally we talk about family law as a separate part of law. And when we talk about family law, when we talk about institutions like adoption, for example, generally what we should remember is, of course, the best interest of the child. The primary goal of adoption is to provide a home for a child, to provide a family for a child, and not to provide childless couples with a child. And I think that is often forgotten when we talk about artificial reproductive technologies. The child is not the focus, but the couple who desires or wants a child. So the pursuit of ARTs is undoubtedly driven by this desire and, to create families and to fulfill these dreams of having a family, which of course I understand. But we must, I think, stop and reflect whether we are adequately considering the rights of the children born through these technologies. The implications of ART are as diverse as the technologies themselves. One of the primary legal challenges is determination of legal parentage. Traditional laws often base parentage on genetic ties or childbirth, depending on the country, right? But ART complicates this by separating conception from the act of bearing a child, and legal systems worldwide grapple with this issue and grapple with questions like, should egg or sperm donors have parental rights or obligations? What are the parental rights of non-biological intended parents? Are surrogacy agreements enforceable or not? So these answers to these questions, of course, vary significantly throughout jurisdictions. That's why a project like this is invaluable, because we can see in a very detailed manner and we can disseminate how our countries in Central and Eastern Europe approach these questions. And based on what we have seen so far and what we have heard also so far today, insufficiently. So I think there is still a lot of action that we have to do. Now, there are of course several questions that we can talk about when we talk about ART. When we talk about the best interest principle itself, the principle of the best interest, of course, occupies a central place in international and national legal frameworks, and it is a cornerstone of family law and of course, child welfare systems. It's enshrined in the UNCRC since 1989 in its Article 3, and it mandates that in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. So it is a commitment to children, of course, and at its core, the best interest principle ensures that in all decisions affecting children, their safety, their well-being, their welfare is prioritized. Now, of course, this principle is very difficult to apply, undoubtedly, because the best interest, of course, varies based on societal context, based on culture, based on, historical context, based on, a varied societal context depends or influence how we interpret the best interest principle. And, of course, even further than that, not only societal, cultural, historical concepts, but also every single child. Each child is different, and their best interest is, of course, different. So what may be in one child's best interest might not be in the best interest of the other. So we need to examine the best interest case by case, with very sensitive approach to each child. Now, it becomes even more complicated when we talk about a yet to be conceived child. And, when we look at the UNCRC, the question of unborn children and the question of intended children, of course, is not mentioned explicitly in the UNCRC. The UNCRC does not explicitly define whether the term child includes the unborn or not, and I think that was the reason why it is so widely ratified, right? Because it was able to be accepted by so many nations across the world. Had it defined clearly the beginning of life, the beginning of childhood, I think the ratification number would have decreased significantly. So I think it was a compromise solution. However, even though it does not define explicitly the beginning of life, I think it's important to mention that we still should and we still need to extend the principle of the best interest in context involving children to be born through artificial reproductive technologies, where the child only exists as a future possibility. Now, traditionally, of course, we apply the best interest principle to existing children and allowing their needs and circumstances and well-being to be directly assessed. In ART, however, the child is not yet conceived, so how can we anticipate their best interest? What will be their best interest? And of course, this raises many questions, like the child's right to identity and the parental and reproductive autonomy and surrogacy and dignity, right? Balancing all of these rights of the child and of the parents, and in surrogacy agreements, even, you know, the surrogate mother. And of course, the question that we already touched on briefly today, I think in Sasha's presentation, you know, predicting parental capacity, whether the parents who kind of go through this ART procedure, do we have a systematic screening? Do we have education of these future parents? Whether there are sufficient safeguards in place to ensure that intended parents meet the physical and emotional needs of a child. And we can talk also, of course, about age that we have mentioned several times today. Is it really in the best interest of the child to be born to a 60-year-old mother or a 70-year-old father, where we can expect that they will not be able to raise that child throughout their lifetime? So I think as technology outpaces legal frameworks, we must strive to uphold the dignity, rights, and welfare of children born through ART and ensure that the best interests of the children are protected, even if they are still just a future possibility. Now, some legislations do talk about the best interest of the child. So just very briefly, I wanted to mention that we do have some ART legislation already in place that recognizes the best interest principle and talks about the best interest. Now, in some jurisdictions, the regulations are elevated to the highest priority. So if we look at the wording of South Australia or Victoria, for example, they emphasize that the interests of the future child are paramount, which means that decisions surrounding ART must center on the welfare of the future child above all else. If you look at Canada, for example, it's still like giving high priority, right? The Canadian legislation says child's interests are given priority. So we are still elevating the child's interest very highly in the Canadian legislation. However, there are other jurisdictions where we talk about the best interest kind of as a limited or side effect of ART, like in Western Australia, where we say that children's interests are to be given proper consideration. It sounds much less efficient, much less restrictive than or much less clear and defined than South Australia or Canada, for example. And the United Kingdom, for example, stipulates best interest and that the children's interest account has to be taken, which is kind of like a minimal approach. We have to look at it, we have to account for it, but it's not necessarily what we base our decisions on. So these disparities illustrate a lack of consensus on how far the best interest principle should extend in ART regulations. While some legal systems place the future child's welfare at the forefront, others approach it as kind of a secondary consideration, subordinate to adult reproductive autonomy or to other societal interests. So I think it's very important to mention that these adult-focused frameworks manifest in different ways, like, for example, limited ethical oversight or anonymity of donor systems. It is very much an adult-focused system, right? In countries where gamete donation is anonymous, the child's right to know their biological origins, which is a critical aspect of identity development, is often overlooked. The commodification of reproduction, for example, in jurisdictions with permissive surrogacy laws, children risk being trafficked as commodities, with the focus on fulfilling contractual obligations rather than safeguarding their rights and well-being. So I think there is a huge disconnect between the best interest of the child and the practical implementation that highlights a gap in ART regulations worldwide. Now, of course, there's also case law that highlights the best interest principle, albeit we have limited case law which talks about the best interest of the child in the context of ART, but there are some cases where judges have touched on the importance of the best interest of the child in the context of surrogacy or artificial reproduction in general. Now, some rights that are connected to the best interest principle and how the best interest principle manifests in context with ART. First of all, the right to health. I think it's very important to mention, of course, the immense positive benefit. Millions of healthy children have been born through ART, including more than 6 million children born through IVF since the technology was developed in the 1970s. And without ART, these children would have never been born. So that's an undoubtedly a positive effect if we look at it holistically. Nonetheless, we have to mention that ART does carry certain risks to fetal health, and thus the health of the born child or the future child. So some recent research indicates that an in vitro environment stresses the embryo, which may have epigenetic effects after being born. And of course, while the UNCRC does not mention the rights of the child before birth, as we discussed, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has stated in General Comment number 13 that the care women receive before, during, and after their pregnancy has profound implications for the health and development of their children. So the committee does consider children before birth and the importance of healthcare before birth, prenatal healthcare, and during healthcare during the pregnancy. So undoubtedly there is an intent to protect the child, the unborn child, in a sense. So from the wording, it's clear what the intent is. Now, of course, we can argue that not all artificial reproductive technology carries risks or has some negative health effects. Some technologies that are connected to ART are created with the purpose of having a healthy child, right? Of ensuring that the child is born healthy. Technology like genetic screening and testing can screen out embryos that test positive for certain serious disorders before they are implanted or even after they are implanted. But in general, pre-implantation genetic diagnostics is a procedure that involves removing one or several cells from the embryo at a specific stage of their evolution to examine the DNA and examine whether there are any disorders or potential for any disorders. And of course, it's technically possible to use this procedure for children that are not born through ART. And it is possible to use this technology for not just screening diseases and disorders, but also for choosing different traits. For example, IVF clinics in some countries in Europe, for example, Cyprus is very famous for this, or several states in the USA offer the selection of the sex or selection of other physical traits of the child. So, for example, a clinic in Cyprus offers these services for 18,000 euros. 18,000 euros is not that much for selecting different traits of your child, and it has, of course, several very serious implications for the future of our society, right? If a child can blame their parents not only for their schooling, their upbringing, but maybe even their genetic traits that they have selected, I think we are talking about very, very serious implications. Now, of course, even if we utilize these technologies to screen out different disorders like Down syndrome, we are getting to a very profound ethical question and conundrum, right? Because while we give parents a chance to choose a healthy child, it's very dangerous and very, very far-reaching to think about how we define a healthy child and the values that we associate with health and the values that we associate with normalcy in our society. So, the screening potentially reinforces societal prejudices against people with disabilities. And these decision-making processes, while very, very personal, they can have a huge societal effect where we undervalue the lives of individuals with disabilities. And of course, I understand if you have a choice to choose between a healthy child or a child born with a disability, it's a very personal choice, and why would you choose something that is worse for your child? On the other hand, what are we teaching future generations, and what is the value that we place on normalcy and health? So I think these are very serious implications. The right not to be trafficked, another right very much connected with ART and different variations of ART. The transfer of genetic material, and in the case of surrogacy, the transfer of a child, of a born child, may amount to the sale and trafficking of children in some circumstances. For example, if there is a surrogate living in one country, is paid a commercial rate by the intended parents in another country, the agreement could be trafficking, even cross-border trafficking of a child, right? And Article 35 of the CRC provides that state parties shall take appropriate national, bilateral, and multilateral measures to prevent the abduction and the sale and the trafficking of children for any purpose or in any form. And also Article 2 of the optional protocol on the sale of children says that the sale of children means any act or transaction whereby a child is transferred by any person or group of persons to another for remuneration or any other consideration. So I think we are, when we talk about surrogacy, and especially when we talk about commercial surrogacy, I don't see a way how it can be regulated that still protects the dignity of the child. And I think we have seen that throughout the years. Even the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children highlighted this fact and said that commercial surrogacy could only be conducted in a way that does not constitute the sale of children if it were clear that the surrogate mother was only being paid for gestational services and not for the transfer of the child. But how can that be ensured realistically? I think it's a very, very serious issue. Now, another issue, the child's right to know their genetic origin, and I know that we don't have a lot of time, so just very briefly I'm going to touch on it. I think it's one of the most significant and contentious issues arising in the context of associated reproductive technologies, and several colleagues have touched on this topic already today. I think it is very important to mention that ART is fraught with several challenges in the context of this right. Anonymity in gamete donation. Many jurisdictions allow or even mandate anonymity for gamete donors, prioritizing the privacy of donors, again, the right of the adult, and the reproductive autonomy of the adult, as opposed to the welfare of the child. In such systems, children who are conceived through ART face significant barriers to accessing information about their biological parentage and their heritage, of course. Then, there are several cross-border complications that we could mention. Different jurisdictions have varying legal approaches to donor anonymity and the preservation of genetic information, often leaving children in legal and informational limbo. So I think all of these challenges really emphasize that the child's right to know their genetic origin is not sufficiently protected in most jurisdictions, and I think this is something that requires a global effect. It's a fundamental aspect of children's identity and well-being, yet it remains inconsistently regulated and realized in ART practices worldwide. So I think this is something that we need to emphasize as well. And I think this is something where, for example, Slovakia has certain gaps in legislation as well, the right to know their genetic origin of the child. So as we stand at the crossroads of unprecedented scientific advancements, when we look at what the future brings, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in the UK and met with a team, a Spanish team, who are working on the artificial uterus, right? And they are not lawyers, of course, so they are not really talking about the law. They are talking about the technological capabilities. And when we talk about it, they were like, you know, you don't really have to be afraid of the technology. It is not in order to replace the woman. It is not in order to replace the womb. It is in order to, right now, what they are able to do is sustain premature pregnancy, or, you know, a child who is prematurely born. They are able to sustain the child in that kind of environment for a few weeks, right? They are not able to replace the pregnancy fully. However, that might be the ultimate goal, right? And when we think about the implications, what it means, a team in Japan, for example, has been able to create gametes from skin cells, right? So creating gametes from skin cells, having an artificial uterus, where does the remnants of family remain? Nowhere in this equation, right? If you don't need a man and a woman to create the child, if you don't need a uterus to sustain a pregnancy, and if you don't have a family to raise that child in the equation that we traditionally have known, we have lost the family. So I think, you know, the future brings several challenges, and I think ultimately, regardless of what technologies we face, whether it's artificial placenta, whether it's uterus transplantation, whether it is cloning, whatever we talk about, I think we cannot lose focus and we cannot forget the child. Because regardless of what the technological evolution brings, if we keep children at the forefront at our policies, then we cannot stray wrong. So I think we have seen how the best interest principle must contend with competing rights and interests. That's undoubted. You know, the autonomy of the parents, the dignity of surrogates, the demands of the global market, often unregulated reproductive market. And we have seen how laws and practices, even when well-intentioned, as I have mentioned, several countries talk about the best interest principle, but still can fail to put the child at the center, treating them more as commodities and denying them their access to genetic origins, or, you know, are placing adult desires above their welfare. So I think there are several ambiguities, and I want to leave you with a few questions. First of all, how do we ensure that children born through ART are treated not as products of contracts, but as individuals with inherent dignity and rights? How do we balance the rights of intended parents with the interests of children when these interests may not always align? And finally, you know, as scholars, as policymakers, as researchers, or simply as adults, human beings, how do we build a legal and ethical frameworks that transcend adult-centric perspectives and truly prioritize the welfare of the child, both born and intended? I think the answers to these questions will define not only the future of reproductive technologies, but also our collective humanity. For it is not just the ability to create life that defines us, but the care, the respect, and the dignity that we afford that life. So as we navigate that terrain, I think we have to remember that the child, whether real or intended, whether existing or yet to be conceived, must remain our North Star. Their rights, their welfare, and their dignity must not be overshadowed by technological progress or adult aspirations. It is our duty as adults, as custodians of law, as scholars, to ensure that the promise of artificial reproductive technologies does not come at the expense of those who cannot yet advocate for themselves. Thank you so much.